Welcome to Kevin Deal Photography, where I take you on my journey through photography. On today's episode, we're going to be doing an in-depth review of the Yongnuo YN50mm F1.8 X DA DSM. I hope you're enjoying this episode, and if you like my style, I highly encourage you to check out my F11 Photography Podcast. It's a weekly podcast where we discuss all in-depth things photography related. I'll leave a link in the description below where you can check us out on both Apple and Spotify, but now back to today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. If you're not familiar with Kevin Deal Photography, we do gear reviews, tips, techniques, and tutorials, and sometimes we dive into film. If any of that sounds appealing to you, click the subscribe button below. So Yongnuo reached out to me and asked me to review the 50mm 1.8 that they put out. And of course, like all my reviews, my opinions are going to be my own. I'm going to be completely transparent. I'm going to tell you what I like about this lens. I'm going to tell you what I don't like about this lens. But this lens is quite intriguing to me because I've been doing a lot of budget third-party lens reviews for the Fuji X mount lately, and the lowest price I've seen for an autofocus lens is $150. Well, this guy, the street price on it is $135, and they actually have it on sale on their website right now for $117.58 for a 50mm lens that goes to f1.8 for its maximum aperture. That's pretty intriguing. So we're going to put this lens through its paces today, but one thing that I definitely want to get off the bat is that they make two versions of this lens. They make a cheaper version of this lens, which is the one that I have. It is the YN50mm F1.8X DA DSM. They also make the exact same lens, but in a pro version. So when you look for this lens online, do keep in mind that there's this version and there's a pro version, and the model numbers are exactly the same. It's just one has pro on the end. Right off the bat, I'll tell you the differences that I see on their specifications between this lens and that lens is that lens does appear to have a more complex optical design. It has the 9 rounded aperture blades versus the 7 on this, 11 elements in 8 groups versus 8 elements in 7 groups on this guy. This is a PC body, which is just a fancy word for plastic. It is completely plastic, whereas the body on the pro version is more robust. Another thing to note is that the pro version of this lens does have some weather sealing on it, and the non-pro version, the one we are reviewing, does not have weather sealing. Another thing to mention about the pro version is it does come with an aperture ring, and this guy does not. It doesn't seem to have a clicked aperture ring though, because it has a little LED readout on top to tell you what aperture you're at. And then the only other thing of note about the more expensive version is that it's about $300, a little over $300, which really puts it in competition with Sigma and some other third-party lenses. So that guy actually has competition, whereas this guy has no competition at its price point at 50mm. So we're going to dive into this guy. Let's talk about the specs, and then we'll do a test on this guy for portraiture, street photography, and many other genres. The Yongnuo YN50mm F1.8X DA DSM lens is made for APS-C Fuji X mount cameras. It has a focal length of 50mm. It has an angle of view of 30.4 degrees. Its lens structure is 8 elements in 7 groups. It has 7 rounded aperture blades. It has a minimum aperture of f16 and a maximum aperture of f1.8. It has a USB-C port built into the lens for firmware upgrades. Its minimum focusing distance is 45 centimeters or 1.48 feet. It has a front filter thread size of 49 millimeters. It comes in at a weight of only 134 grams, and it comes in at a street price of $135 US. So none of this matters if the optical quality isn't good, so let's take the YN50mm 1.8 out for a spin and see how well it works on portraiture and street photography and a lot of other genres, and we'll even test it out a little bit for video. So I'm in my car right before a session I'm about to do, and I want to test out this Yongnuo 50mm 1.8 for portraiture. I'm going to do a session with Misha. I'm going to do a session with Deborah, and we're going to see what the image quality is like. We're going to see what the bokeh is like. We're also going to see how accurate and how fast the autofocus is. So let's go check out how this Yongnuo 50mm 1.8 does for portraiture. as you see these images, there's nothing to suggest that this lens won't do a fantastic job for portrait photography, especially if you're a beginner. I would say that the optical quality of it is decent, not great, but you do need to take what I'm saying with a grain of salt if you're a beginner on a strict budget, because I tend to use much more expensive professional lenses. I will say that for the money, you can't really fault this lens. There are some things that bug me about the optical quality, but in general, it does a great job for portraiture. Now, portraiture isn't the only genre that I use this for. I also decided to use it for street. And even though you typically think of 35mm, maybe 28mm as a street photography focal length, 50mm in APS-C actually gets you a little closer to your subject. And with the name of the game in street photography being discretion, if you're trying to pull in a subject like a person or an animal and you want to get close to it without alerting yourself, I think that this lens does a fantastic job and you should highly consider it for street photography. I took some artsy photos with it as well in infrared, as you can see right here, and it held up pretty well in infrared, where hotspots started happening around f8 and f11. So yes, you can use this as a creative artistic tool, and I think it did a good job there. But talking about the optical quality, shooting it wide open, there was a little bit of vignetting, not any worse than any native Fuji lens that I've ever used, and it cleared up around f4, f5.6, where it went away entirely. In terms of sharpness, I would say it's decently sharp, not amazingly sharp, but when you're purchasing something this cheap, beggars can't be choosers. Alright, so we had some fun with this lens, now let's look at some files. So let's look at the bokeh. I think this bokeh for a $135 lens is perfectly fine. This was shot at 1.8. I think this is a good looking image. Now let's go to the minimum focusing distance. That's why one of the eyes is out of focus. This is at the minimum focusing distance. The bokeh balls get kind of large here, and I'm gonna pull the shadows up just a hair. There you go. And so you can see a little bit of cat's eye on the outside, and that resolves in the middle. And that's what you would expect out of a lens like this. However, something that is very noticeable is zoom in on the hair and look at this rainbow effect that you see. Lots of fringing and aberrations. You can see it once again when you zoom in here. Look, it's almost like somebody took a highlighter to those highlights. Another thing that stands out is that highlights blow out super easily on this. That's something that I experience when I try to attach vintage lenses to my Fuji cameras, and that's usually a result of the coatings not being too advanced, pretty primitive methods of making lenses. And I experienced that same thing with this lens. That could be a good or bad thing depending on the type of photographer you are, but let's be honest, this is a $135 lens, so if that's something that bugs you, you're probably a more advanced photographer anyway, and you buy more expensive lenses to begin with. My experiences so far is that the lens has been inconsistent. Sometimes it'll produce very nice quality images, which I would consider this to be a nice quality image. Everything you see on the walls is fairly sharp, and that's at 1.8. That's a pretty sharp image in my opinion. But then you go to something like this, well, I think the image is good. There's just some weirdness going on with color casting up here, and then you can obviously see tons of rainbow effects of fringing. That's pretty prominent for a lens. But then you see images like this, where I think the image quality is fine. And then in black and white, obviously you don't see fringing, and I think this is a pretty good performer in black and white, but in terms of sharpness, it's never gonna take your breath away. At 100%, you can see at f8, yes, it's a good performer. f8 seems to be the sweet spot on this guy. Look at that crack right there, that's pretty sharp. So definitely a decent performer for its price point. Stop down, it does pretty darn well. So this is my 1 meter away static shot in my studio, and I think we can all agree that this is way too close for comfort, despite the fact that I'm outside of the minimum focusing distance. So I'm gonna back up to a normal looking shot. So now I'm about 6 feet away, and as you can see right here, this is good for head and shoulders. Now I did have a tiny bit of light drop off because I don't normally get this far away from my light, but this is about how you'd want to frame up a shot at 50 millimeters. Normally, I would probably use an 18 to a 23mm to do a shot like this in my studio, but this 50mm 1.8 will give you a good shot in photojournalistic situations. Maybe if you're outdoors, you have a subject you want to bring in closer, you want to maybe take something that's fascinating and isolate it. I see it following me around pretty well with the autofocus. So even though I would say that this does pretty well in terms of autofocus, I'd say it's less than ideal in terms of focal length for video. So now that we've seen some image examples of the Yongnuo YN50mm 1.8X, what are my thoughts? Well, my thoughts are this, is that it's a $135 lens. So if your expectations are sky high, shame on you, but there are some flaws, there are some good and bad things about it, and we're going to talk about those right now. So let's talk about the pros. First and foremost, 135 grams, that is an incredibly light lens. I won't even notice it in my bag. It doesn't push down on my shoulders much. I like the focus ring on it. It's rather large, very easy to get around. So if you are a manual focus type, you're going to like this. Another pro is that they do put this USB-C port on the side. A lot of third-party manufacturers, unfortunately, put their USB-C ports on their lens caps, and if you lose your lens caps, then you have no way to update the firmware. So I want to give Yongnuo credit for putting a USB-C port on the lens itself. Another pro is that in conjunction with the Fuji autofocusing system, it acquired focus decently fast and was pretty accurate. I didn't really notice this lens performing any worse than my native Fuji lenses. Another pro of the lens is that I do think that its image quality in general is acceptably good, and I think that acceptably good is the bar we should set for a $135 lens. And so I think that it meets the expectations I have of it in terms of image quality. Another pro is that there isn't a lot of vignetting wide open on this lens, and with cheap third-party lenses, you tend to experience a lot of heavy vignetting in the corners, and I didn't experience that with this lens. I would actually say that if there's one area where this lens actually performs above its weight class, it's that it gives me about the same amount of vignetting I get out of a Fuji lens wide open. I would say that aesthetically, some of you might look at this as more of a vintagey look. And so if you're looking for a modern lens that kind of produces a more vintagey look with those vintagey flaws to it, then I would consider that a pro for you. But let's talk about the cons of this lens, and there are some. For one, I found inconsistency with my images. I would look at an image and it would be a banger. I would look at an image and then it'd be like, man, that's soft, or there's a weird color cast on it. So if you're looking for consistency, I don't think this lens delivers there. The chromatic aberration and purple fringing on this lens was pretty out of control. So if you're somebody who's driven crazy by that, you're going to be doing a lot of post-production work. If you are somebody who is not driven crazy by that, then you probably won't care. While I did say that the light weight of 135 grams of this lens is a pro, I'm going to say that that is at the expense of build quality because it does use cheap, hollow plastic parts. I feel like this lens only has 2 or 3 accidental rolls out of my bag before I'm purchasing a new one. Another con for some of you is while you look at the back of this lens, you might go, oh, cool, that's a metal lens mount. It's not. It's just silver plastic. It's painted to look like metal, but it's not metal, and so that's something to keep in mind. So who should buy this lens and who should avoid this lens? Well, if you're the type of person who's up and coming and you have a limited budget, this will do a good job for you. If you don't zoom in and pixel peep and you just look at things how they're intended to be viewed on Instagram, on Facebook, if that's what you're shooting for, I don't think people are going to notice a lot of the flaws on this lens. And so for that, I think you should consider getting this lens if you're on that limited budget. However, if you are a pixel peeper and you zoom in and you don't like things like chromatic aberration, you should definitely avoid this lens because it's going to drive you crazy. Another person who should avoid this lens is if you need weather sealing. This does not have that. I really want to do a comparison between this version of the lens and the Pro version of this lens because it has a more complex lens design, and I want to see if there is an uptick in quality there. But keep in mind, there is nothing at this price point, so your options are this if you're on a super limited budget. So my final summary on this is that the pros and cons are about even, and that's what you would expect out of a $135 lens. If you are a beginner just getting into the world of Fuji, you have that limited budget, you want something that'll take good portraits, pretty good portraits, get a nice isolation of your subject, throw that background out of focus, this will get that job done. I found that the color reproduction and the contrast reproduction on it was pretty good. So if you're that person, great. However, if you are somebody who is going to be looking to do this professionally, you maybe want to demand a little bit more quality out of your lens, this could work for you in a pinch, but in all honesty, you're probably going to want to upgrade to either their Pro version or maybe a Sigma or something like that. And then of course, that leads me to my next point is that Yongnuo, if you're listening, I'd love to test out the Pro version of this lens to do a comparison because it is over twice the price. And then that way, maybe my viewers could make a good determination as to which versions of these lenses or maybe even another manufacturer's lens would be better for them. That does it for today's episode. I thank each and every one of you for watching today. I hope you found this review to be useful. I hope you found this review to be helpful. And if you like what you saw today, tell me about that in the comments below. And if you like this channel, I humbly ask you to click the subscribe button below. And just a friendly reminder that I do have my F11 podcast, which is on all major platforms, including Apple and Spotify, and new for 2024 as we are now broadcasting on YouTube. So if you want to hear my more in-depth photography opinions, my uncensored opinions, check out the F11 podcast on all major platforms, including Apple, Spotify, and now YouTube. And until next time, I'll talk to you soon. Bye.